The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Sarah Williams clutched her worn purse with trembling hands. At 52, she had weathered many storms in her life, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Her 3 sons walked beside her, their identical faces set with determination that reminded her of their late father. Marcus, Michael, and Matthew Williams were 25 years old, and, despite being triplets, each had developed his own distinct personality over the years. Marcus, the eldest by mere minutes, had always been the protector. His broad shoulders and quiet confidence made him a natural leader. He worked as a construction foreman and had calloused hands that spoke of honest labor. Michael, the middle child, possessed a sharp intellect that had carried him through law school. He was preparing for the bar exam while working as a paralegal at a small firm downtown. Matthew, the youngest, had inherited their father's gift for connecting with people. He managed a community center in their neighborhood and spent his evenings coaching basketball for local kids. The family had lived in the same modest house for over 20 years. Sarah had raised her boys alone after their father died in a factory accident when they were just 5 years old. She had worked 2 jobs most of their childhood, cleaning offices at night and working at a daycare during the day. Every penny she earned went toward keeping their family together and ensuring her sons had opportunities she never had. Their neighborhood had seen better days. What was once a thriving middle-class community had slowly declined as businesses moved away and property values dropped. Still, Sarah had refused to leave. This was home. This was where her husband was buried, where her children had taken their first steps, and where she had built a life from nothing but love and determination. The legal trouble had started 6 months ago when a development company called Riverside Holdings announced plans to build a luxury shopping complex in their area. The company claimed they owned the land where Sarah's house stood, along with 12 other properties on their street. They produced documents that seemed to show they had purchased the land from the city years ago due to unpaid taxes. Sarah knew something was wrong immediately. She had never missed a tax payment in her life. Her late husband had taught her the importance of paying bills on time, and she had maintained meticulous records of every payment she had ever made. When she tried to show her documentation to the company's lawyers, they dismissed her claims and filed legal proceedings to evict her and the other families. The other families on the street couldn't afford to fight the legal battle. One by one, they accepted small settlements and moved away. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had lived next door for 15 years, packed up her belongings with tears in her eyes. The Johnson family, who had raised 4 children in their small blue house, loaded a moving truck on a rainy Tuesday morning. Soon, Sarah was the only holdout left. The development company's legal team was formidable. They had expensive suits, briefcases full of documents, and decades of experience in property law. Their lead attorney, Richard Blackwood, had a reputation for being ruthless in court. He specialized in development deals and had helped his clients acquire hundreds of properties over the years. To him, Sarah was just another obstacle to be removed. Sarah's original lawyer had been overwhelmed by the case. He was a young man fresh out of law school who meant well but lacked the experience to handle such a complex property dispute. After 2 months of unsuccessful attempts to challenge the company's claims, he had advised Sarah to accept whatever settlement they offered and move on. When she refused, he withdrew from the case, leaving her to represent herself. That was when her son stepped in. Marcus had always been protective of his mother, but seeing her struggle alone ignited something fierce in him. He took time off from his construction job to help research the case and attend court proceedings. Michael threw himself into studying property law with an intensity that surprised even his professors. Matthew used his community connections to spread the word about their fight and rally support from neighbors and local organizations. The 3 brothers had different strengths, but they shared an unshakable belief in their mother's character and integrity. They had watched her sacrifice everything for them throughout their childhood. They had seen her work until her hands cracked from harsh cleaning chemicals and her feet swelled from standing all day. They had witnessed her cry quietly in the kitchen late at night when she thought they were asleep, worrying about money for school clothes or medical bills. And they had also seen her smile with genuine joy whenever they brought home good grades or achieved something they were proud of. Now it was their turn to fight for her. The case had attracted some local media attention, partly because of the unusual sight of three identical young men supporting their mother in court, but mostly because it represented a larger trend of long-time residents being displaced by development projects. Several community organizations had offered moral support, and a few local businesses had donated money to help with legal fees, but the financial burden was still overwhelming. Judge Harold Morrison was scheduled to preside over the hearing. He was known for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for dramatics. At 68, he had been on the bench for over 20 years and had seen every kind of case imaginable. His reputation was that of a fair but strict judge who followed the letter of the law regardless of personal feelings. As Sarah and her sons climbed the courthouse steps that morning, none of them could have imagined how dramatically their lives were about to change. The building itself was imposing, a classical structure with tall columns and wide steps that seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small. Inside, the hallways echoed with the sounds of footsteps and hushed conversations as dozens of people moved between courtrooms handling their own legal matters. The Williams family had arrived early to meet with Michael's supervising attorney, who had agreed to help with the case pro bono. James Patterson was a seasoned lawyer in his 50s who had been impressed by Michael's research and dedication. He had offered to represent Sarah officially, but she had insisted that her sons be actively involved in presenting their case. She wanted them to speak for themselves and their family. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, the three brothers had divided up the work systematically. Marcus had contacted every city office and government agency he could find, requesting copies of all records related to their property. His persistence had paid off when he discovered discrepancies in the tax payment records that the development company had used to support their claim. Michael had drafted legal briefs and prepared arguments that challenged the validity of the company's documents. Matthew had organized a timeline of their family's history with the property and gathered statements from longtime neighbors who could testify to Sarah's consistent tax payments and property maintenance. The development company had not expected such organized resistance from a single family. Their initial strategy had been to overwhelm Sarah with legal paperwork and expensive procedures until she gave up. When her sons became involved, Riverside Holdings had increased their pressure tactics. They sent intimidating letters threatening additional legal fees and suggesting that the family would lose everything if they continued to fight. They also hired a private investigator to look into the Williams family's background, hoping to find something that would discredit them in court. What the investigator found, however, was a family with an impeccable reputation in their community. Sarah Williams was known as a woman of integrity who had never been in trouble with the law. Her sons had clean records and were respected in their respective fields. Marcus had never missed a day of work in 5 years and was trusted by his employers to oversee major construction projects. Michael had graduated magna cum laude from law school and was praised by his professors for his ethical standards and thorough research. Matthew had turned around the struggling community center and had helped dozens of young people stay out of trouble through his programs. The night before the hearing, Sarah had sat with her sons at their kitchen table, looking through all the documents they had assembled. The table was covered with folders, photocopies, and legal papers that represented months of work. She felt overwhelmed by the complexity of it all, but also proud of how her sons had come together to support her. "Are you sure about this?" she had asked them. "We could still take their settlement offer. It's not much, but it would be enough to start over somewhere else." Marcus had reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Mom, you taught us to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. This is our home. Dad's buried in the cemetery just 3 blocks from here. We're not giving up without a fight." Michael had nodded in agreement. "The law is supposed to protect people like us. If we don't stand up for ourselves, who will?" Matthew had smiled at his mother with the same gentle expression she remembered from when he was a little boy. "Besides, we're stronger together than any of us would be alone. That's what you always taught us." Now, as they sat in the courtroom waiting for Judge Morrison to enter, Sarah felt that same mix of fear and determination. The development company's legal team sat at the opposite table, their expensive suits and confident demeanor making them look like they belonged in this formal setting. Richard Blackwood was reviewing his notes with the casual air of someone who had won dozens of similar cases. Behind the Williams family, the courtroom gallery was surprisingly full. Word had spread through the community about the hearing, and many people had come to show their support. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store was there, along with several parents from the community center where Matthew worked. Some of Marcus's co-workers had taken time off to attend, and several of Michael's classmates from law school had come to witness what they saw as an important case about property rights and corporate power. The bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Morrison entered the courtroom. He was a tall, thin man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He moved with the measured pace of someone who had presided over thousands of hearings and trials. As he took his seat behind the bench, his eyes swept across the courtroom, taking in the unusual number of spectators and the diverse group of people who had come to support the Williams family. Judge Morrison's expression was neutral as he called the case to order. This is the matter of Riverside Holdings versus Sarah Williams, case number CV 2023-1847. Will counsel please state their names for the record? Richard Blackwood stood first, his voice smooth and confident. Richard Blackwood representing Riverside Holdings, Your Honor. James Patterson rose next, with Michael standing beside him. James Patterson representing Sarah Williams, Your Honor. I'm joined by Michael Williams, who has been assisting with this case under my supervision. The judge made notes on his papers and looked up. This is a proper. Richard Blackwood stood with practiced confidence, his expensive suit immaculate and his briefcase filled with what appeared to be overwhelming documentation. He had handled dozens of similar cases over his 20-year career, and, to him, this was just another routine eviction proceeding disguised as a property dispute. His law firm, Blackwood & Associates, specialized in helping development companies acquire properties quickly and efficiently, often from families who lacked the resources to mount effective legal challenges. Your Honor, Blackwood began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to winning. This is a straightforward case of unpaid property taxes and clear ownership transfer. My client, Riverside Holdings, legally acquired this property and 11 others on Maple Street through a tax lien sale conducted by the city in 2019. Mrs. Williams and her family have been living on property they do not own for over 4 years. He walked to an easel where he had prepared a large chart showing the timeline of events according to his client's version. The evidence will show that Mrs. Williams failed to pay her property taxes for 3 consecutive years, 2016, 2017, and 2018. Under state law, this created a tax lien that the city was obligated to sell. Riverside Holdings purchased this lien in good faith at a public auction, following all required legal procedures. Blackwood pulled out a thick folder and began placing documents on the evidence table. We have the original tax lien certificate, proof of publication of the required notices, documentation of the public auction, and the deed transfer from the city to Riverside Holdings. This chain of ownership is clear, legal, and unbreakable. He turned to face the Williams family with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with barely concealed condescension. While we sympathize with Mrs. Williams and her sons, the law is clear. Property ownership cannot be determined by emotional attachment or good intentions. It must be based on legal documentation and proper procedures. Judge Morrison listened without expression, occasionally making notes. He had heard similar arguments countless times over the years. Property law was often harsh, and he had seen many families lose their homes due to bureaucratic complications or financial hardships they couldn't control. Still, his job was to apply the law as written, not to make decisions based on sympathy. Mr. Blackwood, the judge interrupted, do you have evidence that Mrs. Williams was properly notified of the tax delinquency and the pending lien sale? Absolutely, Your Honor. Blackwood produced another set of documents. Notice was sent to the property address by certified mail on 3 separate occasions. When those notices were returned as undelivered, additional notice was published in the local newspaper for 4 consecutive weeks, as required by law. Mrs. Williams had multiple opportunities to resolve this matter before the lien sale occurred. Sarah Williams felt her heart sink as she listened to Blackwood's presentation. The documents looked official and professional. The timeline he presented seemed logical. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind. Could she have somehow missed those tax notices? Could there have been some mistake in her record-keeping? But then, she remembered the showbox under her bed where she kept all her important papers. Every tax bill, every receipt, every proof of payment was carefully organized by year. She had shown these documents to her sons dozens of times as they prepared for today's hearing. She knew with absolute certainty that she had never missed a tax payment. Michael Williams had been taking careful notes throughout Blackwood's presentation. As a law student, he understood the technical language and legal procedures being described. He also recognized several potential weaknesses in the opposing side's argument. Most importantly, he noticed that Blackwood had been very specific about some dates while being vague about others. When Blackwood finished his opening statement, Judge Morrison called for the plaintiff to present their evidence. For the next hour, Riverside Holdings' legal team methodically presented their case. They called a witness from the tax assessor's office who testified about the standard procedures for tax lien sales. They introduced certified copies of all the relevant documents. They even brought in a representative from the newspaper who confirmed that the required notices had been published. To most observers, the case seemed overwhelming in favor of Riverside Holdings. The development company had followed all the correct procedures and had documentation for every step of the process. Their lawyers were experienced and professional, and their evidence appeared to be ironclad. Sarah's attorney, James Patterson, began the defense by calling Sarah herself to the witness stand. She walked forward on unsteady legs, acutely aware of the formal setting and the weight of what was happening. The witness stand felt foreign and intimidating, but when she looked out at her three sons sitting in the front row, she found the strength to speak clearly. Mrs. Williams, Patterson began gently, how long have you lived at 847 Maple Street? 23 years, Sarah replied. My husband and I bought the house when the boys were 2 years old. We got married when we were very young, and it took us several years to save up for a down payment. During those 23 years, have you ever missed a property tax payment? Sarah's voice grew stronger. No, sir. Never. My husband taught me that paying your taxes and your mortgage were the most important bills you could pay. Even after he died, even when money was tight, I always paid my taxes first. Patterson had Sarah explain her record-keeping system and her method for ensuring all bills were paid on time. She described how she would mark each payment on her calendar and keep all receipts in organized files. Her testimony was detailed and convincing, but Blackwood's cross-examination was brutal. Mrs. Williams, he began with false sympathy, you were a single mother working 2 jobs after your husband's death, correct? Yes, sir. And you were often exhausted, struggling to make ends meet. Yes, but that doesn't mean, is it possible that in your exhaustion and grief, you might have overlooked some paperwork? Missed some mail? No, sir. I was very careful about important documents. But you moved the boys to different schools during this period, changed jobs twice, and dealt with several family emergencies. Isn't it possible that some mail might have been lost or misdirected? Sarah felt flustered under the aggressive questioning. Blackwood was twisting her words and making her sound unreliable and confused. She looked toward her sons, who were watching with tense expressions. The cross-examination continued for over an hour, with Blackwood systematically attacking Sarah's credibility and suggesting that her memory of events might be flawed. He painted a picture of an overwhelmed single mother who had made an honest mistake but now couldn't admit it. When Sarah finally stepped down from the witness stand, she felt like she had been through a battle. Blackwood's questions had been designed to make her doubt herself, and they had partially succeeded. She wondered if the judge believed her story or if he saw her as just another delinquent property owner trying to avoid responsibility. Marcus Williams was called to testify next. As the eldest triplet, he had been most involved in helping his mother with household responsibilities after their father's death. His testimony focused on the family's financial discipline and his mother's meticulous approach to bill paying. My mother kept a calendar on the kitchen wall where she marked every bill that needed to be paid, Marcus explained. She would check off each payment as she made it. I remember helping her organize receipts and statements when I got older. She never missed anything important. Under cross-examination, Blackwood tried to suggest that Marcus might be mistaken about dates and details from so many years ago. But Marcus had an excellent memory and had spent months reviewing family documents in preparation for the hearing. His answers were clear and specific, and he didn't allow himself to be rattled by the aggressive questioning. Michael Williams testified about his legal research into the case. He had discovered several irregularities in the tax lien process that raised questions about whether proper procedures had been followed. His testimony was technical and detailed, focusing on specific legal requirements that may have been overlooked. Your Honor, Michael explained, state law requires that notice of tax delinquency be sent by both regular mail and certified mail. The certified mail receipts in evidence show that the notices were returned as undelivered, but there's no evidence that regular mail notices were ever sent. Blackwood objected that Michael was not qualified to offer legal opinions, but Judge Morrison allowed the testimony to continue, noting that Michael's research was relevant to the facts of the case. Matthew Williams took the stand last, testifying about the family's deep roots in the community and their reputation for responsibility and integrity. He called several character witnesses who confirmed Sarah's careful approach to financial obligations and her standing in the neighborhood. By late afternoon, both sides had presented their evidence and called their witnesses. Judge Morrison announced a recess before closing arguments, giving both legal teams time to prepare their final presentations. During the break, the Williams family huddled together in the courthouse hallway. The day had been emotionally exhausting, and they weren't sure how well their case had been received. James Patterson was cautiously optimistic but warned them that property law typically favored parties with clear documentation, regardless of the human impact. We've raised some important questions about the validity of their procedures, Patterson told them, but we're fighting an uphill battle. The development company has expensive lawyers and what appears to be proper paperwork. Judges are reluctant to overturn property transfers unless there's clear evidence of fraud or procedural violations. Sarah felt discouraged despite her son's supportive words. She had told the truth as clearly as she could, but she could see that the judge was focused on legal technicalities rather than the human story behind the case. The formal courtroom setting seemed designed to favor people with expensive suits and professional credentials over working families trying to protect their homes. As the courtroom settled back into session, Judge Morrison appeared more thoughtful than he had earlier in the day. During the recess, he had spent considerable time reviewing the evidence packets from both sides, and something was nagging at him. His years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts when details didn't quite add up, even if he couldn't immediately identify what was wrong. Richard Blackwood rose to deliver his closing argument with the same confidence he had displayed throughout the proceedings. His law firm had built its reputation on efficiently handling property acquisitions for development companies, and he had refined his arguments through dozens of similar cases. Your Honor, Blackwood began, the law exists to provide certainty and order in property transactions. Without clear rules about tax obligations and ownership transfers, our entire system of property rights would collapse into chaos. Mrs. Williams may be a sympathetic figure, but sympathy cannot override legal requirements. He gestured toward the stack of documents on the evidence table. Riverside Holdings followed every required procedure. They purchased the tax lien through a legitimate public auction after proper notice was given. The city transferred ownership according to established legal processes. My client now holds clear title to this property, and no amount of emotional testimony can change that fundamental fact. Blackwood's argument was polished and professional, hitting all the key legal points that typically won these types of cases. He emphasized the importance of protecting legitimate property purchasers and warned that ruling in favor of the Williams family would create dangerous precedents that could undermine property law throughout the state. Furthermore, Your Honor, Blackwood continued, Mrs. Williams has had over 4 years since the tax lien sale to challenge these proceedings. The fact that she waited until now, When my client is ready to begin development, suggests that her challenge is motivated more by a desire to delay inevitable eviction than by any genuine legal claim. He concluded by requesting that the court issue an immediate order requiring the Williams family to vacate the property within 30 days and to pay Riverside Holdings legal fees for having to pursue this action. James Patterson stood to present the defense's closing argument. Unlike Blackwood's smooth corporate presentation, Patterson spoke with the passion of someone who genuinely believed in his client's case. He had been practicing law for over 25 years, and he had seen too many working families victimized by companies that used legal technicalities to steal their homes. Your Honor, Patterson began, this case is about more than property law. It's about whether our legal system protects hardworking families or whether it only serves those with expensive lawyers and questionable motives. He walked over to Sarah Williams and placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. Mrs. Williams is not some deadbeat trying to avoid her responsibilities. She is a woman who raised 3 successful sons while working 2 jobs and maintaining her property for over 2 decades. She has never missed a tax payment, never been in legal trouble, and has been a model citizen in her community. Patterson then addressed the technical aspects of the case that Michael Williams had researched. The evidence shows significant irregularities in the tax lien process. Required notices were apparently sent only by certified mail, not by regular mail as state law requires. When those certified notices were returned as undelivered, there's no evidence that alternative methods of notice were attempted. He pulled out Sarah's carefully organized records and held them up for the court to see. Mrs. Williams has maintained meticulous documentation of every tax payment she has ever made. These receipts and cancelled checks prove that she paid her property taxes for 2016, 2017, and 2018, the exact years that Riverside Holdings claims she was delinquent. Patterson's voice grew stronger as he continued. The real question here is not whether Mrs. Williams paid her taxes, she clearly did. The question is how a tax lien was created and sold for a property that had no tax delinquency. Someone made a mistake, and that mistake is about to cost an innocent family their home unless this court intervenes. He concluded by arguing that the burden of proof should be on Riverside Holdings to explain how they could legally purchase a tax lien on property that had no outstanding tax debt. Justice requires that we protect families from bureaucratic errors and corporate opportunism, not enable them. Judge Morrison listened carefully to both closing arguments, but his attention kept returning to a specific detail that had been bothering him since the recess. He had noticed something unusual about the documentation presented by Riverside Holdings, though he needed to examine it more closely to be certain. Before I make my ruling, the judge announced, I want to review some of the evidence more carefully. Counselors, please approach the bench. Both legal teams gathered in front of the judge's bench for a hushed conference. The Williams family watched anxiously from their table, unable to hear what was being discussed but sensing that something significant was happening. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Morrison said quietly, I want to examine the original tax lien certificate that your client purchased. Something about the date stamp concerns me. Blackwood looked surprised but handed over the document. Judge Morrison studied it under his desk lamp for several minutes, using a magnifying glass to examine the fine details. His expression grew increasingly serious as he continued his examination. Mr. Patterson, the judge said, do you have copies of Mrs. Williams' tax payment receipts for 2016, 2017, and 2018? Patterson quickly provided the requested documents. Judge Morrison spread them out on his desk and began comparing dates and reference numbers. After several minutes of careful examination, he looked up with an expression that had changed dramatically from his earlier neutral demeanor. Gentlemen, return to your tables. I need to call for an extended recess to investigate something unusual about this documentation. The lawyers returned to their seats, both looking puzzled and concerned. Blackwood, in particular, seemed uncomfortable with the judge's sudden interest in examining the evidence more closely. Judge Morrison addressed the courtroom. This hearing is recessed until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I need time to verify some information before proceeding with my ruling. As people began filing out of the courtroom, the judge called out, Mrs. Williams, please remain for a moment. I'd like to speak with you and your sons briefly. Sarah and her three sons approached the bench hesitantly, unsure what to expect. Judge Morrison's expression had softened considerably from his earlier formal demeanor. "Mrs. Williams," he said gently, "I want you to know that I take accusations of document irregularities very seriously. I'm going to spend tonight verifying some information, and I want you to return tomorrow prepared for what might be a very different kind of hearing." Marcus spoke up. "Your Honor, is there something wrong with their paperwork?" Judge Morrison hesitated before responding. "I can't discuss specifics until I confirm my suspicions, but I will say this: your family's careful record-keeping may have uncovered something much more significant than a simple property dispute." After the Williams family left the courthouse, Judge Morrison remained in his chambers well into the evening. He had called the county tax assessor, the city clerk's office, and several other government agencies to verify information about the Maple Street properties and the 2019 tax lien sale. What he discovered during those phone calls was deeply troubling. The tax lien certificate presented by Riverside Holdings appeared to contain several irregularities that suggested possible fraud. The reference numbers didn't match the city's records, and the date stamps seemed to have been altered. Even more concerning, Judge Morrison learned that there had never been a legitimate tax lien sale for 847 Maple Street in 2019. According to city records, Sarah Williams had been current on all her tax payments, just as she had claimed. The tax assessor's office confirmed that her property had never been listed as delinquent. Judge Morrison also discovered that Riverside Holdings had been involved in several similar cases over the past 5 years, always involving properties in declining neighborhoods that were targeted for development. In each case, they had produced documentation showing they had purchased tax liens, but, until now, no one had questioned the authenticity of those documents. As he continued his investigation, Judge Morrison realized he was looking at what appeared to be a sophisticated scheme to acquire properties through fraudulent tax lien sales. The scam worked because most families couldn't afford to hire lawyers to challenge the documentation, and those who did fight usually lacked the resources for thorough investigation. The Williams family had been different. Their three sons had the education, determination, and time to research the case thoroughly. Michael's legal training had led him to ask questions that other families hadn't known to ask. Marcus's persistence in gathering documentation had uncovered inconsistencies that might otherwise have been overlooked. Matthew's community connections had brought attention to the case that made it harder to ignore. Most importantly, Sarah Williams' meticulous record-keeping had provided the evidence needed to prove her innocence and expose the fraud. That evening, Judge Morrison made several more phone calls. He contacted the district attorney's office to discuss potential criminal charges. He reached out to the state attorney general's office to report what appeared to be a multi-county conspiracy. He also called the State Bar Association to file a complaint against Richard Blackwood for presenting fraudulent documents in court. The judge realized that tomorrow's hearing would be unlike anything the Williams family was expecting. Instead of ruling on a simple property dispute, he would be exposing a criminal conspiracy that had victimized dozens of families across the region. As he finally left his chambers late that night, Judge Morrison reflected on how easy it would have been to simply rule based on the documentation presented, without digging deeper into the inconsistencies that had bothered him. The Williams family's courage in fighting against overwhelming odds had not only saved their own home but potentially protected many other families from similar victimization. The three triplets who had come to court to defend their mother had uncovered something much larger than they had imagined. Their loyalty and determination had exposed a conspiracy that reached far beyond their small neighborhood, and, tomorrow, the shocking truth would finally be revealed. Back at their home on Maple Street that night, Sarah Williams sat with her sons at the same kitchen table where they had planned their legal strategy. They were exhausted from the long day in court and uncertain about what the judge's investigation might reveal. "Do you think we did enough?" Sarah asked her sons. Michael reached across the table and took his mother's hand. "We told the truth, Mom. That's all we could do." The next morning, the Williams family arrived at the courthouse to find an unexpectedly large crowd gathered on the steps. Word had somehow spread about the case, and local news reporters were interviewing people about property rights and development disputes in the community. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention, but her sons helped guide her through the crowd and into the building. Inside the courtroom, they were surprised to see several additional people at the prosecutor's table. A woman in a dark suit introduced herself as Assistant District Attorney Karen Rodriguez from the White Collar Crime Division. 2 investigators from the State Attorney General's office were also present, along with a representative from the State Bar Association. Richard Blackwood looked notably less confident than he had the previous day. His usual polished demeanor had been replaced by a nervous tension that was obvious to everyone in the room. He kept whispering urgently with his associates and checking his phone repeatedly. When Judge Morrison entered the courtroom, his expression was grave and determined. The casual observers who had come expecting a routine property hearing quickly realized they were about to witness something much more significant. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "Please be seated." Judge Morrison surveyed the packed courtroom before speaking. "Yesterday's proceedings have revealed information that requires immediate attention from law enforcement authorities. What began as a property dispute has uncovered evidence of criminal activity that extends far beyond this single case." A murmur ran through the courtroom as people realized the serious turn the proceedings had taken. Sarah Williams felt her heart racing as she tried to understand what the judge was revealing. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Morrison continued, his voice carrying unmistakable authority, "last night I conducted an extensive investigation into the documentation you presented to this court. I have consulted with the county tax assessor, the city clerk's office, and several other government agencies regarding the tax lien sale that allegedly gave your client ownership of Mrs. Williams' property." Blackwood rose unsteadily to his feet. "Your Honor, I'm not sure what you're suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Blackwood. I'm stating facts." Judge Morrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. There was no tax lien sale for 847 Maple Street in 2019. According to every government agency I contacted, Mrs. Williams has been current on her property taxes for the entire time she has owned her home. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers and gasps. Sarah Williams looked at her sons with confusion and growing hope, while Blackwood's face had gone pale. Judge Morrison continued his devastating revelation. "The tax lien certificate presented as evidence in this case is fraudulent. The reference numbers do not match city records, the date stamps appear to have been altered, and the signature of the city clerk has been forged." He held up the document that had been the cornerstone of Riverside Holdings' case. "This is not a legal document. It is a sophisticated forgery designed to steal property from innocent families." Assistant District Attorney Rodriguez stood up. "Your Honor, if I may address the court." Judge Morrison nodded. "Proceed, Counselor." Based on Judge Morrison's investigation and our subsequent inquiry, the state has uncovered what appears to be a coordinated conspiracy to defraud property owners throughout this region. Riverside Holdings, working with certain employees in various government offices, has been creating false tax lien documentation to steal properties from families who cannot afford extensive legal challenges. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Several reporters began taking notes furiously, realizing they were witnessing the exposure of a major criminal conspiracy. Rodriguez continued, "Our preliminary investigation has identified at least 17 properties that were acquired through similar fraudulent documentation. The total value of the stolen properties exceeds $2 million. Marcus Williams reached over and squeezed his mother's hand as the magnitude of what they had uncovered became clear. They hadn't just been fighting for their own home, they had exposed a criminal enterprise that had been victimizing families across multiple counties." Judge Morrison addressed Blackwood directly. "Mr. Blackwood, you have presented fraudulent documents to this court and participated in what appears to be a conspiracy to commit theft and fraud. I am ordering your immediate arrest." 2 bailiffs moved forward as Blackwood's legs seemed to give way. "Your Honor, I had no knowledge that the documents were fraudulent. I was simply representing my client, Mr. Blackwood," Judge Morrison interrupted. "Our investigation shows that you have been the attorney of record in 16 similar cases over the past 3 years, all involving questionable property acquisitions by development companies. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental." As Blackwood was led away in handcuffs, one of his associates tried to speak for Riverside Holdings. Judge Morrison cut him off immediately. any remaining representatives of Riverside Holdings should know that all of your company's assets are being frozen pending a full investigation. Criminal charges are being filed against the company and its principals." The judge then turned his attention to the Williams family, his expression softening considerably. "Mrs. Williams, I want to publicly apologize for what you and your family have endured. Your property ownership has never been in question, and you have been the victim of an elaborate criminal scheme." Sarah Williams began to cry as the reality hit her. Not only were they keeping their home, but they had helped expose a conspiracy that had hurt many other families. Judge Morrison continued, "I also want to commend you and your sons for the courage and determination you showed in fighting this case. Your refusal to give up and your careful documentation have not only saved your own home but will help us prosecute the people responsible for this fraud and potentially recover stolen properties for other victims." He looked specifically at the three triplets. "Marcus, your persistence in gathering government records uncovered the inconsistencies that led to this investigation. Michael, your legal research identified the procedural violations that exposed the fraud. Matthew, your community organizing brought attention to this case that made it harder to ignore. Together, you three young men have struck a blow for justice that will benefit families throughout this region." The courtroom erupted in applause as people realized the magnitude of what the Williams family had accomplished. What had started as three sons defending their mother had become a major victory against corporate crime and government corruption. Assistant District Attorney Rodriguez announced that her office would be working with federal authorities to investigate similar schemes in other states. This case may be part of a national pattern of property theft targeting minority and low-income communities, she explained. Judge Morrison made his final ruling on the original property dispute. The court finds that Sarah Williams is the sole and legitimate owner of 847 Maple Street and has been throughout the period in question. Riverside Holdings has no claim to this property whatsoever. Furthermore, I am ordering that all legal fees incurred by Mrs. Williams in defending this fraudulent case be paid from Riverside Holdings' frozen assets. As the formal hearing concluded, reporters crowded around the Williams family for interviews. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention, but Marcus, Michael, and Matthew helped field questions while protecting their mother from the chaos. "How does it feel to know you've exposed a major criminal conspiracy?" one reporter asked. Michael answered thoughtfully, "We weren't trying to be heroes. We were just trying to protect our family's home. But we're glad that our fight can help other families who have been victimized." Marcus added, "This shows that ordinary people can stand up to powerful companies and corrupt officials if they are willing to work hard and refuse to give up." Matthew concluded, "Our mother taught us to always fight for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. Today proved that she was right." Over the following weeks, the Williams case made national news as investigators uncovered the full scope of the property theft conspiracy. 17 families had lost their homes to the scheme, and several government employees had been taking bribes to create fraudulent documentation. Richard Blackwood was eventually sentenced to 8 years in prison for his role in the conspiracy. The principals of Riverside Holdings received even longer sentences, and the company was permanently dissolved. Most importantly, the investigation led to new laws requiring additional verification procedures for tax lien sales to prevent similar fraud in the future. Many of the families who had lost their homes were able to recover their properties or receive compensation from the restitution fund created from the seized assets of the criminal enterprises. The Williams family's courage in fighting back had created a chain reaction that brought justice to dozens of other victims. 6 months after the landmark court case, the Williams family had settled into a new normal that none of them could have imagined. Their modest house on Maple Street had become a symbol of resistance against corporate fraud, and their story continued to inspire families facing similar challenges across the country. The neighborhood itself had been transformed. Mrs. Rodriguez had moved back into her house next door after the courts restored her property rights. The Johnson family had returned to their small blue house, and their children were once again playing in the same yards where they had grown up. What had once been a street of empty, deteriorating houses was now a thriving community again. Sarah Williams still worked at the daycare, though she had been able to reduce her hours and give up her night cleaning job thanks to a settlement payment from the restitution fund. She spent her extra time volunteering with a new organization that helped families facing property disputes, using her experience to guide others through the legal system. The three triplets had each found their paths shaped by their experience in court. Marcus had been promoted to construction supervisor and was leading a project to renovate several of the recovered properties on Maple Street. His employer had been impressed by the leadership skills he had demonstrated during the legal battle, and he was now being considered for a management position with the company. Michael had passed the bar exam with flying colors and was working at a new legal aid clinic that specialized in property rights cases. The clinic had been established with funding from the restitution settlement, and Michael's first case had been helping an elderly veteran recover his home from a similar fraudulent scheme. He had discovered his true calling in using the law to protect families rather than corporations. Matthew had expanded the community center's programs to include legal education workshops and property rights seminars. He worked closely with Michael to provide free legal advice to neighborhood residents and had helped several families avoid scams similar to the one that had targeted his mother. His basketball coaching had also grown into a full youth development program that was being replicated in other communities. The wider impact of their case continued to unfold. The investigation had expanded to 3 additional states, where similar property theft schemes had been operating. Over 40 families had recovered their homes or received compensation, and several more criminal organizations had been shut down. The federal legislation known as the Williams Act had been introduced in Congress to strengthen protections for homeowners facing tax lien procedures. Judge Harold Morrison had received national recognition for his thorough investigation and his commitment to uncovering the truth. He had been invited to speak at law schools and judicial conferences about the importance of examining evidence carefully and trusting instincts when something seemed wrong. He often told audiences that the Williams case had reminded him why he had become a judge in the first place. One evening in late fall, the Williams family gathered around their kitchen table for their weekly family dinner. It was the same table where they had planned their legal strategy, but now their conversations focused on their ongoing work to help other families and their individual career goals. "I got a call today from a family in Ohio," Michael reported as he served himself from a platter of his mother's fried chicken. "They are facing a situation almost identical to ours. Their documentation looks suspicious, and they need help challenging it." "How did they hear about us?" Sarah asked. "The Legal Aid Network. Word spreads fast when families help other families. I'm going to fly out there next week to help them get started." Marcus looked up from his plate. "Speaking of helping families, we're going to be starting work on the Henderson property next month. It's been empty since they were forced out 2 years ago, but now that they're getting it back, they want to completely renovate before moving home." Matthew nodded. "Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter has been coming to the center's after-school program. She's so excited about moving back to her old neighborhood. It's amazing how much these property recoveries mean to kids who thought they'd lost their family homes forever." Sarah smiled as she listened to her sons discuss their work. The fear and uncertainty that had dominated their lives during the legal battle had been replaced by a sense of purpose and accomplishment that energized all of them. "You know," she said, "sometimes I think about what might have happened if we had just accepted that settlement offer and moved away. We would have lost our home, but, more importantly, all those other families would still be suffering." Marcus reached across the table and squeezed his mother's hand. "You taught us never to back down when we know we're right. If we had given up, Richard Blackwood would still be stealing people's homes, and dozens of families would still be homeless. The scary thing," Michael added, "is how close they came to getting away with it. If Mom hadn't kept such good records, or if we hadn't had the time and education to fight back, they would have succeeded completely." Matthew nodded thoughtfully. "That's why the community education programs are so important. We have to teach families how to protect themselves and how to recognize when something isn't right." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Sarah went to answer it and found a young woman holding a bouquet of flowers. "Mrs. Williams?" the woman asked. "My name is Jennifer Martinez. My family was one of the ones that got their home back because of your case. I just wanted to thank you and your sons for what you did." Sarah invited Jennifer in, and she told her story to the whole family. Her grandparents had lost their home to a fraudulent tax lien sale 3 years earlier. They had been elderly and didn't understand the legal documents they received. They had accepted a small settlement and moved into a cramped apartment, where her grandfather's health had declined rapidly from the stress and depression. When the investigation started, we learned that their tax payments had been current the whole time, Jennifer explained. "We got the house back, and my grandparents are moving home next week. My grandfather's health has improved dramatically just from knowing he'll be back in his own house." She turned to the 3 brothers. "I wanted you to know that your fight saved my grandfather's life. He had given up hope, but now he's talking about planting a garden again and fixing up the back porch." After Jennifer left, the Williams family sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the impact of what she had shared. Their legal battle had started as a desperate attempt to save their own home, but it had grown into something much larger and more meaningful. "I've been thinking," Sarah said slowly, "about starting a foundation to help families facing property disputes. We could use some of the settlement money to hire lawyers and investigators to help people who can't afford to fight back on their own." Her 3 sons exchanged glances and smiled. They had been discussing the same idea for weeks but hadn't known how to bring it up with their mother. "We were hoping you'd say that," Marcus said. "We've already started looking into the legal requirements for establishing a non-profit organization. I've been researching similar foundations in other states," Michael added. "There's definitely a need for this kind of support, and our experience gives us credibility with both families and legal professionals. And I've been talking to community leaders about hosting workshops and information sessions," Matthew concluded. "People are eager to learn how to protect themselves." Over the following months, the Williams Family Foundation became a reality. Sarah served as executive director, while her sons contributed their various skills to the organization's mission. The foundation provided legal assistance, investigation services, and educational programs to help families protect their property rights. Their first major case involved a community of military veterans whose homes had been targeted by a scheme similar to the one they had faced. Using the experience and connections they had gained from their own battle, the foundation was able to expose the fraud quickly and help the veterans recover their properties. The foundation's success attracted national attention and funding from major donors who had been inspired by the Williams family's story. Within 2 years, they had helped over 100 families recover their homes or avoid fraudulent schemes. Judge Morrison, who had remained in touch with the family, was invited to serve on the foundation's advisory board. At the foundation's first annual dinner, he reflected on the case that had brought them all together. "The Williams case taught me that justice isn't just about following legal procedures," he told the assembled crowd. "It's about having the courage to look deeper when something doesn't seem right, and about protecting those who need protection most." He looked at the 3 triplets, who were now respected advocates for property rights across the country. These 3 young men came to court to defend their mother, but they ended up defending the principle that every family deserves to keep the home they've worked for. They turned a personal struggle into a movement for justice that continues to grow. As the evening wound down, Sarah Williams stood with her sons on the same courthouse steps where their journey had begun. The building that had once seemed so intimidating now felt like a place where justice had been served and important work had been accomplished. "Do you ever regret fighting instead of just taking the settlement?" she asked her sons. Marcus put his arm around his mother's shoulders. "Never. You raised us to stand up for what's right, and that's exactly what we did." Michael nodded. "Besides, look what we accomplished together. We didn't just save our house, we saved a community." Matthew smiled. "And we're just getting started. There are still families out there who need help, and we know how to provide it." As they walked home through the neighborhood they had fought so hard to protect, Sarah reflected on the journey that had transformed her family from victims of fraud into champions for justice. Her 3 sons had grown from young men defending their mother into leaders defending families everywhere. The modest house on Maple Street remained their home, but it had also become headquarters for a movement that was spreading across the country. The love that had brought three triplets to court to defend their mother had grown into something larger, a commitment to ensuring that no family would have to face such injustice alone. Their story had proven that ordinary people could stand up to powerful forces and win, but, more importantly, it had shown that the bonds of family could become the foundation for creating positive change in the world. The Williams family had discovered that the greatest victory wasn't just keeping their home, it was using their experience to help others keep theirs. Sarah Williams became something of a local hero, though she remained humble about her role in exposing the conspiracy. She continued living in her house on Maple Street, but now she was surrounded by neighbors who had been able to move back to their recovered properties. Her three sons used the experience to launch careers focused on helping other families fight similar injustices. Marcus became an advocate for working-class homeowners facing property disputes. Michael passed the bar exam and specialized in property rights law for low-income families. Matthew expanded his community center programs to include legal education and property rights workshops. The case had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption and injustice is a family's love for each other and their willingness to stand together against overwhelming odds. Three young men who had simply wanted to defend their mother had ended up defending justice itself. As the media attention gradually died down, the Williams family settled back into their normal lives on Maple Street. But they would never forget the day when their fight for their home had become a fight for the rights of families everywhere, and how their unity and determination had triumphed over powerful forces that had seemed impossible to defeat. Marcus nodded in agreement. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we're proud to be your sons." Matthew smiled. "And we're not giving up our home without the fight of our lives." None of them could have imagined that by the end of the next day, their simple property dispute would make headlines across the state and send several people to prison. The shocking revelation that awaited them would change not only their own lives but the lives of dozens of other families who had been victimized by the same scheme. As they prepared to return to the courtroom for closing arguments, none of them realized that the most dramatic moment of the day was yet to come. Judge Morrison had spent the recess reviewing all the evidence and documentation presented by both sides. Something about the case was bothering him, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the high windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. In a few hours, Judge Morrison would make a decision that would determine whether the Williams family kept their home or lost everything they had worked for over the past 2 decades. But first, there would be closing arguments, and, in those arguments, a detail would emerge that would change everything anyone thought they knew about this case. The truth that had been hidden for years was about to surface, and, when it did, it would shock everyone in that courtroom, including the judge himself. As they filed back into the courtroom, Sarah looked once more at her 3 sons and felt a mixture of pride and fear. They had fought as hard as they could for their family and their home. Soon, they would learn whether that fight had been enough. Why dispute involving claims of ownership and unpaid taxes? Mr. Blackwood, please proceed with your opening statement. As the formal proceedings began, none of them, not the judge, not the lawyers, not the family, could have anticipated the shocking revelation that would emerge before the day was over. The truth that had been hidden for over 20 years was about to surface, changing not only the outcome of the case but the understanding of justice itself. The courtroom was quiet except for the sound of papers rustling and the court reporter's keys clicking as she transcribed every word. Outside, the morning sun continued to climb higher in the sky, but inside the windowless courtroom, time seemed suspended as 2 very different versions of the truth prepared to collide. Sarah looked at her 3 sons sitting beside her and felt a surge of pride that temporarily pushed aside her fear. Whatever happened today, she knew they had done everything possible to fight for what was right. The little boys who had once clung to her skirts had grown into men who were willing to stand up for their family and their principles. The battle was about to begin, but they were ready to face it together.